Yeah, it's a pleasure to welcome Professor Itai Cohen from Cornell. Professor Cohen graduated in the Department of Physics with a PhD in physics from the University of Chicago. And he's currently a professor at Cornell. He did a postdoc at Harvard for a bit and then has been at Cornell for the last several years. As you would see, I mean, Professor Cohen's work is very, very broad. I mean, he does fluid dynamics, aerodynamics of insect flights, origami metamaterials, microrobotics, and the thing that actually caught my eye was movement coordination of tango dancers. I don't know if he's going to talk about that, but today he's going to talk to us about some of the work that he's been doing in microscopic robots. With that, let me turn the floor over to you.
Terrific. Thanks, Sridhar. Okay, so as Sridhar said, I have a broad range of interests. And today I'm going to tell you about one of those areas that we've recently been developing. And this particular area of microscopic robotics really started at a conference that I went to back in when I was on sabbatical in the desert. And so this conference was a conference on water. And basically, people were talking about all sorts of properties of water. And it was the end of one of these talks that I had sort of my epiphany. And, you know, this gentleman gave a talk for about an hour about water percolating through rock. And at the end of his talk, he basically said, and so after 10 years of research, we now understand that when water percolates through rock, it doesn't just do this, it also does this. And I thought to myself, I've got to get here. This was horrible. I've got to find a new line of work. I have to invent a company. I've got to, you know, move to a different university. I have no idea what I'm doing here. Get out. And so it's out of that sense of desperation that all of the work that I'm about to tell you emerged. This sense of crisis. Okay, so let me start by again asking, what is it that's so fascinating about microscopic robots? Well, let's think about what robots do for us at the macro scale. At the macro scale, robots have really revolutionized our society. They sweep our floors, they make our cars for us, they transport people from one location to another. They organize our warehouses. They're used for surgery, and they explore distant planets. And the question that we want to ask, really the overarching question, is what would it take to shrink this kind of functionality, robots with this degree of functionality, to the 100-micron scale? Now, this problem of shrinking machines is an old one. Richard Feynman, in his famous lecture, There's Plenty of Room at the Bottom, spoke about miniaturization. Most people remember that lecture for his words on the miniaturization of the transistor. That's this device that you see on the bottom left here. That's the first transistor. And of course, after 50 years of Moore's law, now we can produce complicated chips that have feature sizes down to 2 nanometers and allow us to do all sorts of fantastic computation. And so that version of Feynman's vision has really been borne out and is quite sophisticated at this point in time. But during that lecture, Feynman also talked about the miniaturization of machines. And I would claim that this is an area that still has a long ways to go. Now, certainly there's been tremendous progress. So when you think about miniature machines, you might have noticed that in 2016, the Nobel Prize was given to these 3 gentlemen for inventing molecular machines. And so let me show you a few of the devices that they were able to synthesize chemically. And so in the top, what you're seeing is a little switch, a device where that ring can move from the left to the right side. That's kind of what you're seeing in the bottom middle here. And on the very bottom right, what you're seeing is what I can only assume is the world's slowest car. It's a nano car where the rings that make up the tires rotate by some angle every time you put in a molecule that causes a reaction that twists the wheels. So these are spectacular achievements, and the synthesis that was required to get these was really phenomenal. Still, nevertheless, they leave you kind of cold when you look at all of the amazing things that biology can do at this scale. So at this scale, biology can create machines that cleave polymers. They make polymers, they unassemble and assemble them. They can have little motors that carry cargo and walk across microtubules. You have pores that can open and close, letting certain chemicals in and out. You have a vast infrastructure of fibers that are controlling the rigidity of the cells or the pulling apart of DNA. And really, my feeling is that if you wanted to start working on machines at the molecular scale, you'd get a lot farther by just hacking biology, using all of the machinery that biology has already created, making variations in the DNA that codes for these proteins, and then using that approach to essentially search, the space for something that does what it is that you want it to do. Now, if you start looking at a slightly larger scale of microns, then a new technology comes into play, that of electronics. And the idea here is that we have an opportunity to make machines at the micron scale, which now take advantage of a different technology, one that is complementary to biology, and it's that of electronics. And so the idea is that you could try to hack Moore's law, try to use all of the infrastructure that we've developed for electronics, and then use that to essentially make the brains of the robot, if you will. And now what's missing is how to marry that with the mechanical aspects that we want to make interact with that brain, or that we want the brain to control. So here at Cornell, we're fortunate enough to be a part of a campus that has a world-class clean room facility. This is a photograph, an aerial view of the Cornell nanofabrication facility. And so we're well positioned to do this kind of engineering. And what I'm going to tell you about today are some of the elements that we're starting to put together in order to achieve our vision. So let me start with the brains of the robot. I said that Moore's law allows you to create the brains. That's a solved problem. What is not a solved problem is taking that computer chip and moving it off of the wafer. This is something that John Rogers has been spearheading, and I want to tell you a little bit about the kinds of things that my colleagues are doing here at Cornell along those lines. So if we look at this work by Paul McEwen and Al Molnar, what they've been doing is creating little tiny devices that can be removed from the wafer. They're only about 16 microns thick. In this particular case, what I'm showing you is a very simple computer. It calculates the voltage between the two pads, the top pad and the bottom pad, and then it sends it out as a signal. So this device has, again, these two voltage pads. It has a bank of photovoltaics, this circular bank of photovoltaics, a MOSFET transistor, and an LED. And all it does is it reads the voltage difference between the two pads, and then it communicates that as a intensity signal from the LED. And it also has these two release tags on the side here. And if you're like me and like as a kid to make model airplanes, these would be sort of the plastic bits that are holding your piece in place. And all you need to do is snap this piece off and you'd be ready to take it off of the wafer. So I want to sort of just give you an idea of just how small these things are. So here are a couple of computer chips, again, off the wafer, that were developed by folks at University of Michigan and Berkeley. These computer chips are the kinds of things that you might put into a pill that you would swallow and would take pictures of your gut as it's going through. And the device that we're making is shown on the right. And the reason that you don't see it is that it turns out that there's two Abraham Lincolns on the penny. One of them is on the face of the penny. That's what you're seeing here in the upper left. But there's another Lincoln on the penny, and that one is situated inside the Lincoln Memorial. I don't know if you can see it. Let me expand it for you. So here's the Lincoln inside the memorial. And if you look on the chest of the Lincoln, those are the devices that we're talking about that Al and Paul are making. So they are truly tiny. Now, tiny, of course, doesn't necessarily mean better. These Michigan and Berkeley devices, they certainly are more powerful from a computational perspective. But tiny does have advantages. For example, we can make 10 million of these devices on a wafer, which means that each one of them costs less than a penny, and you can use them ubiquitously. So you can imagine sprinkling them. You wouldn't want to do that with an expensive piece of hardware like the ones on the left. So look down at your fingertip and you might see a tiny speck of dust. In the future, that speck of dust might be a little sensor that you sprinkle on to different surfaces to measure the pH of your skin or how dry it is or something like that, and then be able to give you a treatment that is in accord with your skin's properties. All right, so what we want to do now that we have this ability to make these computational sensors and devices at this scale, what we want to do is we want to marry that with the kinds of techniques that people have been using to get locomotory patterns in microscopic bots. So here I'm showing you a few of the strategies. At the top left, you're seeing a corkscrew with a magnet on the end. So literally you rotate a magnetic field, and in a viscous fluid, this thing will bore itself through and essentially move left or right depending on the handedness in which you're rotating the helix. On the right, you're seeing a biopsy device made by the Gracias group at Johns Hopkins. So the idea is that you essentially have a wax coat that when you melt, it spring loads it releases a spring-loaded trap, and that then biopsies a piece of tissue that you can then use to move around. And on the bottom, in the middle there, on the left, what you're seeing is, this is, and I kid you not, supposed to be a wheelchair for sperm that can't make it to the egg on their own. So you put this crown on one of these sperm, and then you direct it to the egg in order to get artificial insemination. Anyway, I don't make these devices, I just report on them. So what we wanted to do is try to think about how could you start to marry the kinds of things that people are doing in this locomotory part with the kinds of devices that Al and Paul are making. And this was the task that we gave Mark Miskin, our postdoc at the time, who was leading our effort. Okay, so you might think, well, what's the problem? Let's just take machines as we know them and just try to shrink them down to the micron scale. This is a hard thing to do. People have tried. So for example, here is an example of a micro turbine engine. It was made by the Epstein group at MIT. This was a $10 million effort that resulted in a very deep understanding of why it's not possible to simply shrink machines down to the micron scale and have them work. So this device never worked. And the reason it doesn't work is that there's some physics that changes when you go from the macro scale to the micro scale. Fluids become viscous. Electrostatic forces inhibit surfaces from moving past one another. And of course, the assembly of these machines becomes more complicated. It's hard to shrink down your graduate student to the micron scale with a little micro screwdriver and get them to assemble something as complicated as a jet engine. So it really seems that if we're going to start to make machines at this scale, we're going to need to use a, and the one that we're going to try to go after is to try to use the same techniques that people have been using to make computer chips to print a 2D robot, which then, using the rules of origami, folds itself up into a 3D robotic structure. Let me stop there and just ask if there are any questions and if what I'm saying is clear so far.
Well,
Sorry,
just to participate, and it has nothing to do with your wonderful talk thus far. It's what was the conference that you were at that sent you fleeing from rocks?
Yeah, it was an Army conference on water. You know, it's kind of like a water scarcity thing.
Yep.
Yeah, so that was the conference.
What a change! Phenomenal transition.
Yeah, I mean, the stuff that that I was doing there was on colloidal suspension. So it's stuff that we still do, but certainly not in the way that we did it at the time. Good. Is everything I'm saying so far clear, Ed?
Yeah, I was going to ask if you could just say a little bit about why origami.
Yep, I'll get to that in a second. Great. Okay. If there's,
I was also interested in, maybe you will explain, you know, what do you mean by origami rules, but that maybe is what is coming.
Yep. So if these are the questions, let me continue. All right. So why origami? Well, it turns out that origami has undergone a revolution over the last decade, in part spurred by an effort in the NSF to link up origami artists with engineers in order to try to take advantage of this sort of 100-year-old art form to try to make structures and devices and machines and metamaterials that are engineering, that have engineering purposes. So today, you can take a course at MIT on a program called Orgamizer. Orgamizer takes any 3D shape, it scans it, and then it spits out a folding pattern for that shape. So in this particular case, this origami pattern, if you have a origami master like Tomohiro Tachi here, folding it for about 8 hours, will essentially form the Stanford bunny, okay? So any shape that you want, basically, we can form using origami. My group was involved in this effort in the aspect of mechanics. So what we were interested in is how do you take origami materials and start to use the way that they're folded to imbue the mechanics that we're interested in on these sheets. So for example, if you take a normal Muraori sheet, and if you look at panel C here, if I pop through defects, I turn a valley into a mountain in a particular order, I can pop those defects in so that I can create a hinge. And so this sheet can essentially fold on that hinge. If I take that same sheet and I pop a different configuration of the defects, I can make a rigid spine that does not allow any folding. So now the sheet is rigid along that spine. And in fact, we showed that you can pop these defects in and out at will to reprogram the mechanical behavior of this sheet and make it stiffer, make it so that it can't bend in certain ways. All of this just by popping in these mountains and valleys into one another. In another piece of work, we showed that by changing the pattern of folds, you could create a topological mechanical material where if you compress it, only one side of the sheet deforms. This is the equivalent in the topological electronic materials of having the current only going along one edge of the material. We showed how to create bistable switches. In this case, you're seeing a device that folds or essentially snaps between an open and a closed configuration. This is the square twist. And we showed how to program the vertices of these sheets to enable you to direct force transmission. So in this particular case, the vertices act as diodes that let forces go in one direction, but not the other. And so there's a lot that we've learned about the mechanics of origami at this scale. And people have been starting to think about how one would make a robot that you could print in 2D, slap a couple of batteries on it, and then get it to essentially fold itself, in this particular case, align some inner leg, and then have it walk off the page when it's ready to go. Now, admittedly, 80% of these robots caught fire as they were running off the stage, but you get the idea. The vision of printing something in 2D and then getting it to fold itself up and walk, that's a spectacular idea. And we know how to do the shapes, we know how to do all of the mechanics. And so the only thing that's remaining is to shrink it down to scale. And origami happens to be a terrific platform for that, because as long as you keep the ratios of the panel to the sheet thickness the same, you can essentially create the same structures in the macro scale as you do at the micro scale. So in this particular case, you're looking at a randlet bird. This one is made out of paper. This one was made by Ryan Hayward's group out of a polymeric material that expands with temperature. It's polynipam. You take the polynipam, you sandwich it between two rigid plastics with different gaps at the creases. So if you have a crease where the gap in the top is bigger than the gap at the bottom, when the polynipam expands, it's going to bend because the top has more room to expand. And that creates a fold, and that's what allows you to make this bird at the micron scale. Now, if you want to go even smaller, and if you want to start to think about integrating fab, like hard materials from the fab, you really need to think about what paper you're going to use at this scale. An origami artist is only as good as their paper. And so right around the time that we were starting to think about this, Paul and his colleagues were starting to experiment with the thinnest paper that you could possibly imagine. This is a single sheet of graphene that Paul's student, Melina, is pulling in between these two pads. And what you're seeing is a kirigami pattern. Kirigami is where you make cuts in paper that have this staggered shape. And what Melina's doing is she's pulling the pad and then extending out this kirigami pattern, but now in a single sheet of graphene. And so we've then gone on to make other types of paper. In this case, what you're seeing is a 5 nanometer thick sheet of glass that we made using atomic layer deposition. This was an effort that was spurred by Kyle Dorsey and Tanner Pearson. We've made sheets with holes in them, little cuts that allow us to essentially make metamaterials, sheets that can locally expand their area and adopt non-zero Gaussian curvatures. And so this is the kind of paper that we're now starting to use. But of course, you don't want to have to fold this paper. I mean, it took Tomohiro Tachi 8 hours to fold the macroscopic pattern. What we want to do is essentially have the paper fold itself. And that's really the challenge of working at this scale, is trying to have everything happen on its own. And so what I want to tell you about next is a couple of methods that we've been developing, and I hope you'll be able to see the vision for where we hope we can go with this. Okay, so let me tell you about some actuation and folding ideas. I'll tell you about 2 methods that we've been trying out. One is chemical and the other is voltage driven. Okay, so if you want to self-fold something, what do? Well, first, you have to take your device and you have to make it asymmetric so that it only bends on one side. Essentially, you're making a bimorph. Bimorphs used to be used as little switches, little fuses. It's like when you take 2 pieces of metal, slap them together. If they have different coefficients of expansion, one side will expand more than the other, and you'll get a bend. All right, so in this particular case, our bimorphs are going to be atomically thin sheets, but it's the same concept. Then, if you want to localize this bending, what you can do is you can put massive panels, little rigid panels that prevent the bimorph from bending underneath them. That restricts the bending to a fold. And then you can make your fold pattern follow any kind of origami that you want in order to generate a 3-dimensional shape. So that's the strategy. Let me show you how we do. So this is work that Mark Mishkin did. What you're seeing here are the plastic panels, And what's really devious about this video is that the hinges, they're invisible. You can't even see them. The hinges are made out of 1 sheet of graphene and 2 nanometers of glass. That's our bimorph. And what Mark does in this video is he puts some acid on, and that opens the structure. And as the acid diffuses away and the system becomes more basic, the structure essentially closes back up. And so what you're seeing is that the glass, in this particular case, is responding to the pH that we're using in the material. And it goes something like this, that when you're at high pH, the glass opens up and has a curvature that's 0, it's flat. When you're at low pH, when you put some acid on, that's what makes it close up. So the chemistry behind this is, of course, spectacular. This has a very rich and storied history dating all the way back to Josiah Willard Gibbs, who was interested in equilibria between solids, chemicals diffusing into solids, and the solutions that the solids are embedded in. And so way back when, in 1906, people already knew that you could use glass as electrodes, as little storage devices for ions. And eventually Kistler and then Larsen Kahn started to understand that if you used, for example, sodium nitrate or potassium, you could essentially create stresses in cover slips that either bowed them out or bowed them in. And Larsen Kahn really figured out the mechanism that's at work here. What they showed is that when you put in potassium into solution, the sodium in soda lime glass, so all glass is made with soda lime and has sodium ions in it, the potassium ends up displacing the sodium, and that expands the glass. So when you put in potassium, the surface that's in contact with the solution ends up expanding relative to the other surface, and you get bowing of the cover slips. And when you do the opposite, when you put in a large amount of sodium, you displace the potassium, and now the cover slips can bow inwards. And so this, of course, is the mechanism that you all know about, because it's what's used to make the glass in every single one of our cell phones. So this is an amazing piece of engineering where you essentially take soda lime glass, you dip it into a potassium-rich mixture, and that creates a potassium-rich surface to the glass. Now, when you scratch a Gorilla Glass, what happens is that instead of opening up, the system is under such stress that the scratch actually closes, because the potassium is trying to expand the glass, and so it closes into the crack. And that's why Gorilla Glass is so tough. It doesn't pull on the cracks, it actually closes them up. Amazing. So this is exactly what we're using to do our bending in this particular case. All we're doing is replacing the potassium with acid molecules, H3O, and the idea is that the acid diffuses into and out of the glass. When it diffuses in and displaces the sodium, it essentially swells the glass, and when it diffuses out, the glass returns to its normal state. And so we can fit all of this data with this black curve, and that has the form, which is just 1 over the rate constant, which is pH dependent and sodium dependent. So if we change the sodium concentration, we can change where this transition happens. And if we change the pH, then we get this nice step function from one state to another. And all of this happens super fast. This folding and unfolding that you saw happens quickly because it's all just taking place at the nanometer scale. All you're doing is replacing the very surface of the glass, and the time scale goes like the diffusion. So if the length goes very, very small, then that time scale becomes minuscule. And that's why this thing happens at the sub-second time scale. Okay, so with this, we were able to make all sorts of devices, little tetrahedra, little spiral shapes that could be used as antenna, a book that closes on itself and clasps shut, a cube. And this particular image of the cube graced the cover of PNAS. And we got a lot of attention for this, including from Breitbart News. That's right, this is no longer fake science, it's real stuff, and you can believe it. So I'll tell you just a little bit more about the chemical case, and then I'll stop to ask questions. So if you now take the way that you manufacture your biomorphs and you reverse the patterning, so instead of silicon dioxide on the top, you make it on the bottom, you can create either mountain or valley folds. And that allows you, with this process, to essentially make any kinds of origami shapes that you want. And these are some of the structures that Barsh, my student, made with Robert Lang, who's a world famous origami artist. Okay, so let me pause here and ask if there are any questions about the chemical actuation process that I just showed you.
That relationship between curvature and pH almost looks like it's just piecewise constant. Is there something desirable about making it a smooth function?
I would say that this is kind of a log scale. pH is a log scale. So the fact that it's going down pretty sharply, basically makes it like a switch. There is some smoothness, and you can try to do that in the delivery, but the device itself, the stresses, respond. So the higher the concentration gradient, the faster this thing will go. So it really depends on the delivery of the acid, how quickly this thing will snap down.
Thank you. Fascinating.
Any other questions about the chemical actuation?
So Itai, have you ever tried soft materials? The same phenomenon instead of using glass, because certainly, polymers or other organics could respond similarly, particularly if they're charged.
Yep, absolutely. And that work that I showed you from Ryan Hayward, he's really the person who's pushed the soft materials, along with David Gracias, quite far. So lots of people have been working with soft materials. The difference with soft materials is that the processing for the electronics is not going to work with the soft materials. And so that's what I'm going to show you about next. But it's definitely an active area, and lots of people are doing it, people who are probably better at the soft materials side than we are.
I mean, you can also introduce light responsive.
Yep, you can do benzoazides that are responsive to give you liquid crystals that essentially can be disordered and ordered. We're pursuing those kinds of things. Yep. Great. Okay, let's hold off on the rest of the question. Let me tell you about another process that we've been developing. So this one is an electrochemical actuation. What we do here is the bottom layer is going to be made out of platinum. The top layer is just an inert capping layer. It could be either graphene or titanium dioxide or something like that. And when you put a voltage on the platinum, you can absorb anions onto the surface. And those ions essentially create a surface stress. And that bends the sheet because the other side is not absorbing ions, so it's not feeling that stress. So if you do this, then you can pick up one of these devices like Mark is doing here with an electrode, and all you've got to do is tune the dial, and this sheet will bend and unbend on command. Okay, it's really an amazing piece of engineering. And this device operates at voltages that are comparable to CMOS, so less than a volt or so. It consumes very little power. It's rate limited by the viscosity of the water that surrounds it. It works in cell media, and it integrates with the electronics fab. So let me tell you some of the things that we're trying to build off of this technology. So one of the things that we've thought about is, could we start to think about creating artificial cilia? So as you all know, in your body, there are two main methods for transporting fluids. One is the pulmonary system. Your heart is putting pressure on some fluid to drive it through the channels that are your arteries and veins. And the idea is that there's another, and that technology, I should say, has been developed into an engineering field called microfluidics, a major field in engineering. But there's another technology that the body uses to transport fluid, and that's cilial transport, where cilia can essentially locally move molecules of fluid across surfaces. And this cilial transport, we haven't really figured out a good way to incorporate it in engineering devices. And part of that is because the best cilia that we can make right now are magnetically actuated, which is difficult to change. Other electronically actuated cilia use voltages in the range of 1,000 volts. But here we have a chance to make little cilia that are operable at the volt range. So let me show you the kinds of things that we can do. So if we now make these cilia, what you're seeing here is a video at 30 hertz, but these cilia are beating at 50 to 60 hertz. And so what you're seeing is that as they're beating, if you look very closely, there are little colloidal particles that are being moved up and transported towards the top of your screen. On the left, when we don't actuate the cilia, the particles aren't moving anywhere. Now, the reason these things move, the colloids move, is because the cilial beating is not reciprocal. On the way down, you get a different pattern for the beating than on the way up. And it's a little bit complicated, but it has to do with the sperm number, which is the ratio of the viscous stress to the elastic stresses. And because the shape of the hair is different on the way up and on the way down, you get a slight change in the trajectory, and that's what allows you to give non-reciprocal motion at the microscale and drive these flows even in the Stokes regime. So if you can do this with one set of cilia, so let's say I have this panel driving the flow up, then by putting these together in different patterns, I can create any flow pattern. So for example, if I put them in a square pattern like this and actuate the inner ones, then I'm driving flow inwards from all four directions. That creates a sink flow. And the flow is coming in and then moving out of the page into the third dimension using the cilia transport. And of course, I could actuate any number of combinations. So for example, if I actuate all the outer ones, I get a source where now the fluid is coming in from above and going out in plane, or just parallel transport, or I can get a saddle shape where they come in from above and below and out through the sides, or just a turning flow. And now if I have a whole array of these, I can essentially create a flow pattern in the top part of the array that sends the particles going in this direction. Whereas if I actuate the bottom ones in a different pattern, I can get a completely separate pattern. And maybe if these two are operating together, then only in this regime where the two flows are near each other, do you start to exchange materials between the two flows as this fluid is being directed. And all of this can sit inside of a microfluidic channel in order to give you a sub-channel mixing or flow behavior that you might be interested in. So we're working on that. We're making these little devices that can be actuated electrically. In this particular case, we have a chip that's sitting on this 128 pin connector that we can then activate with a DAC and a computer program like LabVIEW. And with this type of surface, you could really create any flow pattern that you want and try to mimic the kinds of things that are happening in our body. In this particular case, you're looking at a cilial transport from cavities inside your brain that have carpets of cilia moving neurotransmitters in different directions. And these carpets can essentially move these neurotransmitters in response to your mood. So as your mood changes, the transport pattern will change as well. And so these are the kinds of things that we're going to start to be able to mimic and maybe even investigate in slices of brain. We can move the neurotransmitter in a different flow pattern and see how that affects the brain function. If you now take these and again put these panels on, then you can direct the folding to occur at a hinge. And now you start to open up all the world of origami and kirigami for these electrically driven actuators. So for example, with Nick Abbott, Tandaskas Gazit, and Lisa Apsel, we're creating metamaterials. These are sheet-like devices that you can print, and then by actuating some subset of the hinges, you can make it adopt three-dimensional geometries that will hopefully someday allow it to locomote and then maybe wrap some sort of chemical source. So this would be a robot that we're trying to create. So we take advantage of this bidirectional folding, and this time what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a metamaterial where we can get a splay between these two panels. And the way we do that is with an origami hinge, which is composed of a mountain fold that can create a 180-degree fold, and two valley folds, these dashed lines, which can fold to 90 degrees. And when we actuate this origami hinge, we should be able to get a splay between the panels. Is that clear? Okay. And so this is what you're seeing in these videos where Chinkun and Wei have made these metamaterial sheets, and each of these hinges is only 5 microns across, okay? And in this particular case, we're activating the entire sheet. So every hinge is being activated simultaneously through a voltage that's being sent from the bottom to the entire sheet. On the very bottom right, you're seeing a device where we've tethered the surface or the outer edge of the device to the bottom surface. And that means that if the middle part is increasing in area, it has to be bowing out of the plane in a 3D bubble. So you're seeing something that can create a shape moving out of the plane. And the next thing that we're doing, which is probably going to happen in about a week or two, maybe after March meeting, we're now creating these sheets where we're wiring it up so that we can have 2 inputs, one for one set of hinges, another for a different set of hinges. And by changing the voltage on the 2 wires that are coming into the device, we should be able to get a range of shapes for this 3D surface in both the square metamaterial and the triangular metamaterial. If we take these same actuators and instead of working around 0.2 volts, we start working at 1.5 volts or 1.2 volts, we can get oxidation and reduction reactions to happen in the platinum. So you start with a pristine layer of platinum capped on one side by titanium dioxide. And as you drive the voltage up, you can get the oxygen atoms to absorb and then be driven into the platinum itself. That creates a surface stress, but it also piles oxygen atoms at the surface of the platinum so that when you take the voltage off, there's a barrier for the oxygen atoms to diffuse out of the platinum. And that leads to a hysteresis loop. And these oxygen atoms don't really come out until after you apply a negative voltage to drive them out. And so this hysteresis loop leads to shape memory. So this is the curvature as a function of the applied voltage. And the point is that you can go along this point all the way back down to negative voltages before the curvature changes. So you can have 2 voltages, but the same curvature. That's what we mean by a shape memory material that can retain its shape. So here you go. This is a gripper where we can take the electrode off, it retains its shape. Now you put the electrode back and it can retain its shape in a different state. That's what we mean by a shape memory material at this scale. It's different, the mechanism is different from the SMAs where you have a phase transition from Martin-Zittig phase transition between states. Here, you're really driving ions into the material, and the barrier that the ions form for them to come back out is what gives you the shape memory behavior. And there's a nice bit of physics that we figured out on how to predict the amount of time and the voltage that you need to apply in order to get the oxide to form a certain thickness, which then translates to how much curvature you can generate. So we know exactly how much voltage and for how much time you need to apply that voltage to get a bending that you're interested in from your material. So we can make these devices in series so that you can touch each individual pad and they're insulated from one another. So only each pad is actuated at will. You can create pads where you have the first pad actuating the first hinge. The second pad goes through a wire in the first hinge to the second hinge. So now I can activate the first one and I get the first hinge, and then I can activate the second one and only the second hinge is actuated. And with these kinds of motifs, we can start thinking about deployable neural electrodes that are introduced into the brain in a compact form that we can then actuate the hinge using one voltage. And then through a separate wire that's insulated, we can start to record from neurons that are laterally displaced by millimeters inside the brain. And this would replace the act of essentially using ice picks to go through the brain in multiple locations to be able to test the correlation laterally between neurons. We can create actuation stages. So these are devices that essentially can be repositioned either in the Z or the XZ direction. And again, they can retain their shape even when we disconnect the power. And then we can connect the power again and get them to go back to their original stages. And that's what you're seeing here. We can do the same kind of electrical actuation, but now with origami. You have a hexagonal pattern here, a Mura Ori, and what is now the world's smallest bird actuating at something like the 60 micron scale. These patterns are smaller than the footprint of your hair. You can take a hair diameter. That's how big these devices are. And you can, again, actuate them and unactuate them at will. They'll hold their shape, so you can use critical point drawing and generate these beautiful origami structures that you're seeing in the SEM. And as you can see, we really are working with atomically thin paper. These bright yellow regions are 10 nanometers in thickness, and the rest of these pads are only a half a micron thick. Okay, so let me just finish off by telling you what we would like to do with these. So the ability to make the world's thinnest actuators, which is this work over here, we're plotting for you voltage versus the actuation curvature. So these devices work at some of the lowest voltages and some of the highest curvature folds that you can generate. And so that's important because if you want to start making robots, if you're working with these materials, you can make robots that are macroscopic. Working with these materials, including some of the soft materials that Sam was describing, allows you to make milli-robots. But if you want to make really micro-robotic systems, then you've got to be actuating at a level that's sub-micron, so at the 500 nanometer scale, which is roughly where we're at. And now you can start to build the micro-robots that we're interested in. So how would you go about doing that? Well, you can start to put them in contact with electrical devices like a photovoltaic here that you can shine light on. And if we attach it to one of our devices, then by shining light on this, you should be able to get the device to actuate. And this is what you're seeing in this movie. Mark shines light on this photovoltaic, and this thing is waving hello at you. It's a very small wave. I'll play the movie again. But it's still a wave nonetheless, kind of like the Queen. We're of course interested in more of an American wave. That's where we'd like to be, but okay, it gives you the idea of what could be done. Now you start to get greedy. So you make a front photovoltaic and a back photovoltaic for the front legs and the back legs, and you build a bajillion of them. You put pads on to restrict the bending so that you can control how the robot is actuating. And if you do all that, you can generate what we lovingly call Brobot. Brobot is a robot that belongs on a beach somewhere. You know, he's got chest hair and he's flexing his muscles. And of course, the chest hair is what we lovingly call schmutz. It's just junk that comes from the releasing process. And of course, Brobot has some defects. His legs are torn off. We'd like to fix that, but you get the idea. And these devices are super robust. You know, you can smush them and they come right back to life when you apply a laser voltage to a laser onto the photovoltaic here. And if you work really hard at eliminating the schmutz and getting the release process right, you can generate this robot. This is a 70 micron by 40 micron by 2 micron robot. This robot is so small that these little particles here on the side are moving in a Brownian fashion. This robot folds itself up, and by shining the laser on the front and then back photovoltaics, it walks itself off the page. Now, the amount of electronics that you could put on this robot is staggering. We can, of course, already put the payloads that I showed you in the very beginning that Al and Paul are making. That's trivial. Those are all at the scale of these robots. But on this 10 micron by 10 micron footprint, you could put an entire Intel 4004 chip if you're using a 50 nanometer line width process. The clock rate for these things could be a gigabit per second. The Voyager 1, which just left our solar system, has a clock rate of 8 kilobits per second. So this device could hold something like the computational power of the spaceship Voyager. You can get 60 megabits of memory. And at Cornell, we're starting to think seriously about how we would go about generating the brains for these to fabricate robots that really have sheet-like properties, but with little chips embedded on them, or ones that are individual units that we can put a brain on, or bubble rockets like you're seeing in the bottom here that can essentially maneuver with a brain on board to direct their patterns. So the way we're doing this is we're collaborating with a company called XFab, and XFab has developed a silicon on insulator process similar to what John developed in his lab. And the idea is that we fabricate the chip and the photovoltaics, all the rest of that gets fabricated in XFab. It comes to us, and then we put on the legs and the rest of the infrastructure as needed. And with that, we can essentially start to design and marry the kinds of things that you can do with commercial foundries with the stuff that I've shown you here today. So what do you get when you send your designs to XFab? About 3 to 6 wafers, each about 8 inches. At Cornell, we split the cost around 4 groups, which means that it costs about $20,000 to get your chips patterned. And we're already doing this. So here is a first chip that came back. It's basically a clock circuit that oscillates, and we get a wafer. We then tested that all of the components work as advertised. And now we're integrating it with a hexapod robot. And the idea is that by actuating the limbs with different timings, we can generate different gates for this hexapod robot. So this is our chip already incorporating the legs. I'm going to show you one device that we've recently been working with. This one over here that I'm highlighting in white. So you get the chip from XFab, and then what we do is we pattern the platinum electrodes and the legs of the robot so that you can shine light on the photovoltaics that come, and with the chip automatically giving you the locomotory gate so that you don't have to shine the laser on the front or back photovoltaic. All of that gets taken care of by the timing circuit. And so how does this work? Here's a video of one of the release devices. I don't know if you can see it, but this bottom leg right here is moving in and out ever so slightly. This is our hello world from our first release device, which we literally got yesterday. Also yesterday, we got our first electronically integrated cilia. So this is a chip where we just shine light on it. It's connected to a cilia, and when we play this movie, this oscillation from the cilia is all just coming from shining light and the chip doing the timing on its own. You can connect 2 rows of cilia to get a metachronal wave in these cilia. So now these are beating at a different phase than these. And again, these are hot off the press, and it's only going to get more interesting from here on out. With Michael Rubinstein, we've been thinking about how to make more sophisticated brains for these devices. And really, we're poised to make a world where we could suck these robots up into a hypodermic needle, inject them into different environments where there might be a paramecium that's crawling nearby. So what happens when we can make 10 million of these devices, release them en masse like you're seeing in this video, each device costing fractions of a penny, able to lift 10 times their weight, able to interact with biology at the scale of a single cell? What would you do if you can start to think about a Roomba at a scale of 100 microns, cleaning off some sort of artificial tissue, or having a microfactory that builds devices at this scale, or transports materials, or maybe a microsurgery machine that's operating at length scales that are an order of magnitude smaller than the Da Vinci machine can, or even rovers that explore environments. Now we're not just interacting with biology through a microscope top down, but at the scale of tissues and organisms, really in a democratized way. So that's the vision of the microscopic robots. I hope I've shown you the kinds of things that might be possible someday with the technology that we're developing. Of course, this work was done by an enormous number of people. The grad students, postdocs, and PIs have just been spectacular. And the credit really goes to this entire team for making this happen. I know it's noon, so I'm not going to talk too much about this slide, which is all the other things that we've started to do since I've had my mental breakdown at that conference. But these include looking at population behaviors, starting to think about magnetic handshake materials where you can create Watson-Crick pairing of panels using dipoles, looking at the neuroscience of insect flight, where we can turn individual neurons on and off and see how that affects their behavior, their response to magnetic perturbations that we put in midair. Work that we're doing to connect cartilage mechanics with rigidity percolation phase transitions, and work that we're doing to understand the mesoscale structures that give shear thickening fluids their wonderful properties. And so with that, I'll thank the Cohen Group. This is us in Ithaca, where it's like this every day. And if you're interested in working on some of these problems, either as a graduate student or postdoc, please contact me. We, as you can see, we have a lot of projects and a lot of things that we're interested in exploring in the future. And I'll just leave this slide up so that you can look up these papers if you're interested in the specifics of what we've done. And I'm happy to take any further questions.